Hello, I'm Bill Serban, and this is an episode in the Cognitive Challenges of Effective Teaching video series produced by my colleague Steve Chu and me. This segment focuses on transfer of learning. In this classroom scene, students are reviewing guidelines for a new class assignment. Two students have different reactions. One sees a similarity between the new assignment and assignments from a prerequisite course and thinks she can draw upon that experience to get started. A classmate looks at the new assignment and is stuck. Even though she completed the same prerequisite course, she sees no connection. The new assignment is unfamiliar and she doesn't know how to approach it. These are everyday episodes of successful and unsuccessful transfer of learning. Successful transfer of learning is the productive, appropriate use of knowledge in new contexts. You learn something today and apply it appropriately at a later time. So transfer is the application of knowledge, skills, rules, facts, concepts, procedures, and even habits learned in one situation to a different situation. We think of transfer of learning as the gold standard for teaching. We tend to view teaching as effective and successful to the extent that students can apply what they have learned in our classes to new contexts. Not only in our own classes, but across classes, and hopefully to life beyond the classroom. Even though almost all learning involves some degree of transfer, research has shown that transfer is not an automatic consequence of learning. Unsuccessful transfer is common. Research consistently finds that students have difficulty applying acquired knowledge and skills to situations where they are appropriate. Often we become aware of transfer failures on tests where students are trying to apply their knowledge. Here's an example from a national test with 45,000 13-year-olds who were given the following problem. An army bus holds 36 soldiers. If 1,128 soldiers are being bused to their training site, how many buses are needed? Perhaps you could anticipate these results, but they're still a little surprising. First of all, 70% of the students performed the division correctly, but 29% said the answer was 31 buses, remainder 12. 18% said the answer was 31 buses. Only 23% gave the correct answer. We don't need to look at middle school students for examples of unsuccessful transfer. If you're a teacher, you probably have firsthand experience with students' unsuccessful transfer episodes. Here are some common scenarios. First, in your class, students have difficulty applying concepts they learned in previous courses. How many times do we hear colleagues talk about how students really don't know anything from the course they took previously? Second, you teach a concept on Monday, and on Wednesday, a significant number of students seem to be unaware of that concept, or at least unable to use it in class. Third, on exams, students struggle with questions that involve application of course concepts. And then fourth, you hear back from colleagues that students you taught in fall term aren't doing very well in the spring term. And the implication is that they didn't learn very much in your class. Let's talk a little bit about the root causes of failure to transfer learning. The research literature is quite extensive, but two factors that have a strong influence on the difficulty of transfer are: one, depth of initial learning, and two, the degree of similarity between the learning context and the transfer context. Let's take a look at each of these separately. In general, students fail to transfer knowledge when they have a poor grasp of the subject. Adequate understanding of the subject matter seems to be a precondition for effective transfer. In this slide, I've made a very crude distinction between shallow and deeper understanding. But shallow understanding seems to be the kind of understanding students have that is very surface-oriented. where it's superficial, underdeveloped, and fragmented. When students have a poor grasp of the subject matter, transfer is not very likely. In fact, think a little bit about it. How could it be? They barely have any control over the concepts, so it's going to be very difficult for them to see those concepts being used in other situations. When students have deeper understanding of a topic, their ideas tend to be more elaborated. They see similarities and differences between concepts. And when that's the case, transfer is more likely. It's still not a certainty, but it's more likely. So depth of initial understanding and initial learning is a key factor in whether or not students are going to be able to use their knowledge productively. The second key factor in transfer is the degree of similarity between the learning context and the transfer context. Generally, when the transfer context is very dissimilar from the learning context, students may not see how their knowledge is relevant or how their current knowledge can be applied to the new situation. In this slide, you see a number of transfer contexts. Starting at the top, there's in class, following instruction that students have received. There's homework out of class, new problems on a test, a different course altogether, and then outside of school in real life situations. Obviously, these differ in how closely they resemble the initial learning context. At the top, we have a situation in which students have learned something, and immediately following that, they are engaged in practice problems, solving the same identical kinds of problems they just learned how to do. At the bottom, we find that students are outside of school in real life situations, and something that they've learned in school may be relevant and appropriate to some particular situation. But that is very different context than the initial learning. Researchers use the terms near transfer and far transfer to characterize transfer situations. In near transfer, the transfer task and context are very similar to that of initial learning. For example, in class, students solve practice problems that are identical to the ones they just learned. In far transfer, both the transfer task and the context are dissimilar from initial learning. So, students use their knowledge in their personal lives where it is relevant and appropriate. And in general, as you might expect, near transfer tends to be much easier than far transfer. Okay, to summarize briefly, 3 points. Transfer involves productive use of knowledge and skills in new situations. Second, applying knowledge and skills effectively and flexibly is difficult and often doesn't happen at all. Third, transfer tends to fail when students have poor understanding of the subject and are not aware of how, where, and when their knowledge can be applied. This brings us to the question of how it is that we can help students be more effective in transferring their learning to new situations. Here are 5 recommendations to improve transfer of learning. Let's start with the first idea, and that is that the class that you're teaching is a transfer context. So one thing that you can do is help students transfer learning into your class. You can provide opportunities for students to activate prior knowledge and practice applying it to your course. One way to do this is with review sessions in which students recall knowledge or engage in problems from previous or prerequisite courses relevant to your course. These reviews, combined with your guidance, can help students reactivate relevant knowledge and identify connections between what they learned previously and the content and skills in your course. Second, promote depth of initial learning. As we've discussed, students often fail to transfer because their initial learning is shallow and underdeveloped. Of course, there's no single depth of understanding strategy that will fix that problem, but a recommendation is to recognize that poor understanding is likely to derail transfer, and that promoting depth of understanding goes hand in hand with transferred learning. A third recommendation is to use multiple examples. Instructors often use a single example to show how a new concept can be applied. but research has shown that one example is relatively ineffective compared to multiple examples. In one study, for example, researchers compared the performance of students who learned and then retrieved one application example versus those who learned and retrieved several application examples. On a test that involved new application questions, students who had retrieved multiple examples during learning outperformed students who repeatedly studied a single example. These researchers concluded that repeatedly retrieving and applying knowledge to different examples is a powerful method for acquiring knowledge that will transfer to a variety of new contexts. I'll give you the reference to that study in the teacher resource section at the end of this video. A fourth recommendation is to make conditions of applicability explicit. Provide students with explicit information about when and where to apply their knowledge and skills. There really is no reason to expect that students can recognize every transfer context on their own. They need explicit guidance. And then fifth, use application questions on exams and assignments to emphasize the importance of transfer as a significant part of developing mastery in your course. If you're interested in additional information about transferable learning, go to my webpage at takinglearningseriously.com, and I've listed two additional references. The first is titled Retrieval Practice and Transfer of Learning, Fostering Students' Application of Knowledge. It's a nice set of guidelines that shows how to use retrieval practice as a way to support transfer of learning. And the second is the study that I referred to earlier in the video, titled Retrieving and Applying Knowledge to Different Examples Promotes Transfer of Learning. We hope you have an opportunity to explore transfer of learning with colleagues, and if so, here are a few discussion questions to help you get started. Thanks for your attention. We also hope you will explore other videos in our series.